Hello and welcome, or even better, welcome back to the History of Bangalore. I am Ramjee Chandran, here with episode 20 of Season 1, The Early History. I continue with my series on the Chalukyas, and today I bring you part 7, The Fall of Pulakesin II, or Immadi Pulakeshi. Some people have written asking how I connect the larger history of the Deccan with that of Bangalore, seeing as how this podcast is called The History of Bangalore. The answer is that if you consider the whole area that constitutes the larger Bangalore, it was ruled largely by the Gangas, at least until the early 11th century. Their history, though, is inextricable from that of the larger kingdoms of the Deccan, whom they served as feudatories, or family, or friends. So, 1,000 years before Kempe Gowda built the Pete, Bangalore as we know it today had a major role to play in all terms: civic, military, and importantly, commercial. Obviously, it doesn't hurt to have an understanding of what happened to the dynasties that ruled the larger Mysore Deccan, and so here we are. And now, before I move on to the fall of Pulakesin and the first fracture to the Chalukyan kingdom, a word of thanks to the Prestige Group, whose corporate support makes this podcast possible. Building cities one landmark at a time, they transform dreams into reality. You can be a part of the future. Simply add prestige to your life. Okay, the story so far. In the last episode, I went over the Battle of Narmada and how Pulakesin and Harshavardhana both put pay to each other's ambitions of invading the entire country to the north and the south of the Vindhyas, respectively, and they both accepted the Narmada as their new natural boundary. I have noticed that modern cartographers take this boundary into account, and maps showing the Chalukya Empire use the Narmada as the northern reach of the empire, just as well. The years immediately following the Battle of Narmada was a time of peace. Maybe this peace was because both these young kings, Harsha and Pulakeshi, saw the inevitability of peace. Equally matched with fierce armies, the principle of mutually assured destruction was the best deterrent. And therefore the treaty that each stays on one side of the river, and the lords of the Dakshinapata and the Uttarapata left the other alone and moved on with their respective careers. Peace or not, Pulakesin was restless. Now that the north of the country was out of bounds for him, he decided to take his expansion east. But before anything else, he needed to consolidate the gains of the last wars that we have discussed in the previous episodes. But he wasn't going to waste any time, so he appointed his younger brother Vishnuvardhana as Yuvaraja and told him to take care of the administration of the kingdom in Vatapi while he went off on conquests. And this is very similar to what his own father, Pulakesin I, had done, asking his brother Mangalesha to take care of the kingdom while he went on his campaigns. Pulakesin then embarked on a significant campaign of conquest in the eastern Deccan. Southern Kosala and Kalinga quickly submitted to his rule without much of a fight. Next, he laid siege to and captured Pishtapura in a battle on the shores of the Kunala lake. The inscriptions describe this battle as fierce, but there are no more details about it. In time, Pulakesin sent Vishnuvardhana, his brother, as a viceroy to govern these new territories, referred to as the Andhra or the Vengi country, and he tasked him with the completion of the process of conquest, which, by 631 AD, Vishnuvardhana had successfully achieved. Not only that, Vishnuvardhana asserted his own independence, but in a way that didn't upset his brother. And that was the birth of the branch of the Chalukyas known as the Eastern or the Vengi Chalukyas, a dynasty and a kingdom independent from the Badami or the Vatapi Chalukyas, and that kingdom lay in the deltaic area of the rivers Krishna and Godavari. All this, as I said, was done happily, as Kubja Vishnuvardhana, that being his name, had the blessing of his brother Pulakesin. But why did Pulakesin agree? Some say that this was a smart move on his part, as he did not want a repetition of what happened when his father had appointed Mangalesha to the throne. The parallels were similar: a younger brother who operated as deputy king, an uncertain heir apparent, and the possibility that Vishnuvardhana might have the same designs on the entire kingdom should Pulakesin die, or rather when he died. Anyway, this move to allow his younger brother to establish his own dynasty worked well. The Eastern Chalukya kingdom would go on to rule for 500 years, a history, though, plagued with infighting, fratricidal wars, and many weak rulers, and yet a few kings who managed to glue this dynasty together for such a long time. Moving back to the Western Chalukyas, or more specifically the Vatapi Chalukyas, later they would technically become the Western Chalukyas in their comeback many years afterwards. But right now, Pulakesin had consolidated a vast territory for his kingdom. He had subdued and occupied the important and lucrative western ports, established a border of peace in the north, and then invaded and acquired the Andhra areas of Vengi, where he had established his brother as viceroy. History tends to express the reign of Pulakesin in terms of the battles he fought for the expansion and the defense of his kingdom. History does that to any king. But these battles are fought over spans of time, and when they are narrated together, it would appear that all these kings did was to wage war in rapid succession and make their foes quake with fear. We know this because most of the early medieval history that we learn is from the Prashastis about the royal lineage written by poets, and those become our principal sources of history. Now, these Prashastis are written in praise of kings and focus on how valorous they were and how others quaked in their resplendence that was second only to God, if not equal to. I guess that wars are more newsworthy than poetry readings, and so often their contributions to culture, literature, art, religion, music often merit only a passing mention, except within academic circles. But the accounts of visitors and others add to what we know, and one such notable visitor to the kingdom was the famous Chinese scholar Xuanzang. Xuanzang went calling on both Harshavardhana and Pulakesin. He had the highest praise for both kings, spoke glowingly about each of their abilities, and made a comparison about how alike they were. Then the monk said this about Pulakesin. He was a Kshatriya by birth, and his name was Pulakesin. The benevolent sway of this king reached far and wide, and his vassals served him with perfect loyalty. The great king Siladitya at this time was invading east and west, and countries far and near were giving in allegiance to him, but Mohalocha refused to become subjects to him. These people were fond of learning, and they combined orthodoxy and heterodoxy. Now, Siladitya was Harshavardhana, and Mohalocha was clearly the area of Maharashtra ruled by Pulakesin, and the refusal to become a subject suggests that Harshavardhana had designs on invading the Pulakesin's territory and didn't make it. Anyway, Xuanzang's account has much more about the size of the kingdom, and it appeared that he had been allowed to wander freely among the people and speak to anyone. Xuanzang said, and I quote, "The inhabitants were proud-spirited and warlike. They were grateful for favors and revengeful for wrongs, were self-sacrificing towards supplicants in distress, and sanguinary to death with anyone who treated them insultingly." But the Chinese scholar reserved his most evocative description for the instruments of war, elephants and soldiers of the Chalukyan army. He wrote, "Their martial heroes, who led the vanguard of the army in battle, went into conflict intoxicated, and their war elephants were also made drunk before an engagement." The events of war are described as a man who gets completely drunk just before battle and will fight 1,000 men simply by being drunk. And given such martial strength, Xuanzang spoke of a certain arrogance on the part of Pulakesin, and I quote, "Relying on the strength of his heroes and elephants, the king treated neighboring countries with contempt." Now, this could be interpreted that the Buddhist scholar's remark was a subtle warning, and such overconfidence may have been a cause that led to terrible consequences, and all that's coming up later in this episode. Now, all that said, it was not just about being a warrior. Pulakesin had a diplomatic side to him too, and one evidence of this is what we learn from the works of the Persian Arabic scholar At-Tabari. In the early 10th century, At-Tabari, in his magnum opus, Ta'arik ar-Rasul wal-Muluk, which means the history of the prophets and kings, mentioned an Indian king called Farmisha, and this is probably a corruption of Parameshwara, one of Pulakesin's many titles. And it speaks of how the Indian king had sent a delegation to the Sassanid ruler Khusrau Parvez, Khusrau was a Persian king of the Zoroastrian faith, and that faith is the same as the modern Parsis in India follow. The Sassanids were successors of the Parthians who had ruled a large part of northwest India, and they and the Seleucids were successors of Alexander the Great, all of whom had history with India, and so no one was a stranger. In At-Tabari's book, there is an account of how Pulakesin had sent ambassadors to the court of Khusrau as a friendly and diplomatic gesture, and it turns out that Khusrau returned the favor, and he sent a delegation of ambassadors to Pulakesin's court. And the evidence of this is to be found in the Ajanta caves, specifically cave number 1, that features a large mural depicting Immidi Pulakesi, it can't be anyone else, receiving men clearly dressed in the clothes of the old Sassanids. Now, the story of Khusrau has a rather interesting twist to it, and this involves an astrological prediction, a prophecy even, made by Pulakesin. And I have that story for you right after this commercial break.
Just how the North Star is the guiding light, the star of North Bangalore, Prestige Camden Gardens is a guiding light where your search for the perfect home ends. Prestige Camden Gardens, the star of North Bangalore. Step up to luxury with 3 and 4 BHK apartments on Tanisandra Main Road, 10 minutes from Manyata Tech Park, 25 minutes from the airport, and well connected with other parts of the city. Prestige Camden Gardens. Prices starting from 2.25 crore onwards. To know more, visit prestigeconstructions.com. RERA approved.
Hello, I'm back with the intriguing story of how Pulakesin played astrologer. It was the year 628 AD, and we are in the city of Ctesiphon, which is near modern-day Baghdad, after Khusrau had lost the Battle of Nineveh to the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius, a significant turning point in the Byzantine-Sassanid wars. His son, Shiruye, had dethroned him and imprisoned his father and was trying to execute him for having been disloyal to the family. He had drawn up an accusation with 11 counts against Khusrau, accusing him of being disloyal to his own lineage, to his own grandchildren. Khusrau defended himself by saying that he had actually acted with compassion. He claimed that what he did was only because of an astrological prediction that he would be killed by his elder son, and despite this, Khusrau had spared Shiruye out of fatherly love. The astonishing part is that the source of this prediction was a letter from Pulakesin. Now here is Khusrau's plea that I repeat from the passage in At-Tabari's book Tariq. Now note that the we and our are royal plurals for I and mine. And here goes. 2 years ago, Pulakesin, king of India, sent to us in the 36th year of our reign ambassadors carrying a letter, imparting to us various news and presents for us, for you, and our other sons. He also wrote a letter to each of you. To you he presented, don't you remember it? An elephant, a sword, a white falcon, and a piece of gold brocade. When we looked at the presents and at the letters, we remarked that yours bore the mark private on the cover in the Indian language. Then we ordered that the presents and other letters should be delivered to each of you, but we kept back your letter on account of the remark written on the outside. We then sent for an Indian scribe, had the seal broken, and the letter read. The contents were, Rejoice and be of good cheer, for on the day Daiba Adar of the 38th year of the reign of Khusrau, thou wilt be crowned king and become ruler of the whole empire. Signed, Pulakesi. As it turned out, Daiba Adar translates from the Persian to 25th February 628, and indeed, the prophecy came true, and in the 38th year of his reign, Khusrau was put to death, and Shiruye, to whom Pulakesin had addressed the private letter, became the king of the Sassanids, as had been prophesied. Astrology. Very tempting. What continuing significance all this had on Pulakesin we don't know, but who cares? This story is weirdly fulfilling in itself. Back in Vatapi, the restless and overly ambitious Pulakesin decided that he needed dominion over the south, all that he could get his hands on. And this brought him into an enmity with the Pallava dynasty, one that would become a bloody family feud for generations. The battles between the Pallavas and the Chalukyas have ranged from border skirmishes between their respective feudatories to all-out attempts to invade each other's capitals, Kanchipuram and Vatapi. And it all probably started when Pulakesin invaded Bengi and established the eastern branch of the Chalukyas, and that had been around 617 AD. That area that lies across the Andhra districts was ruled by the Vishnukundins. They were feudatories of the Pallavas, and their territory lay right next to the Pallava territory. The Pallavas saw this as a threat. For years they had watched with some alarm as Pulakesin and his predecessors had successfully expanded their empire across the northern parts of the Deccan. Word about the Battle of Narmada would have doubtless reached the Pallavas, and all in all, it would seem that the might of the Chalukyas would soon match the might of the Pallavas in battle. And they weren't wrong. There is an interesting concept in ancient lore. It's called the Mandala theory. It is articulated in excruciating detail in the book History of the Dharma Shastra, but a simplified version would be similar to the old adage, "The enemy of my enemy is my friend." The Mandala theory has it that kingdoms with common borders would become enemies, and kingdoms that are adjacent to the neighboring kingdoms would be friends. It all makes sense when you consider the history of so many wars across the globe, across the span of history, right up to the present day. But in our instant case, the Pallavas did not like one bit that the Chalukyas had defeated the Vishnukundins, and the Bengi kingdom was no longer a convenient buffer state. And now the Chalukyas had moved in right next door. And then going by the Mandala theory, the Chalukyas had become friends with, and on occasion in-laws of, the other Tamil kingdoms, the Pandyas, the Cholas, and with their closest allies, the Gangas, they had become unfriendly with the Nolambas and the Banas, they being Pallava cohorts. Enmity was but a natural consequence. And now we must cycle back to our episodes on the Gangas, specifically Durvinita, and how he took the help of the Chalukyas to get the throne that had been wrongfully denied to him by his father, Avanita. And as I had mentioned before, the Pallavas and the Gangas had been very good friends. But when the argument between Durvinita and Avanita happened, the Pallavas had taken sides with Avanita and alienated Durvinita, creating an enemy in him. Now with Durvinita on the throne, the powerful and the very martial Gangas became all but a feudatory of the Chalukyas, and together they embarked on all their campaigns against the Pallavas. The early ones among these included the battles at Andheri, Alattur, Purulare, and Peranagra. Of these places, Alattur is near Coimbatore, Purulare in Chingalpet, and Peranagra is Salem. And Purulare is the same as Polilur. Polilur is the location of two other historic battles, the battles of Polilur 1780 and 1781 of the Second Anglo-Mysore War between Hyder Ali and the East India Company. This is where Hyder and Tipu won. Now these battles are mentioned in the Nalala plates, the inscriptions of the Ganga dynasty, with all the victories attributed to Durvinita Ganga, who, as I said before, became Pulakesin's father-in-law. And it's most likely that all of these battles were nothing but a part of the larger Chalukya-Pallava conflict. And so the battle at Polilur was in all likelihood the same battle that had been fought by Pulakesin II against the Pallava king Mahendravarman I. Polilur was deep inside Pallava territory and was just about 25 kilometers from Kanchipuram, the capital of the Pallavas, and therefore the aggression would have been that of the Chalukyas and the Gangas to have advanced so deep into the Pallava territory. Irrespective of all of these different points of views of the Gangas and the Pallavas, it seems clear that Pulakesin was oblivious to all that, and he had his own agenda, total domination. And if we are to follow the chronology of the Aihole inscription, Kanchipuram, the Pallava capital, was his next target. And the inscription describes the Chalukyas' force as one would describe a well-appointed army with a well-planned invasion. Now the Battle of Polilur was good for Pulakesin. The records indicate that the Pallava king had ordered a retreat into the fortified city of Kanchipuram and vanished behind the walls of Kanchipuram, as Ravi Kirti put it. But that's where it seemed to have ended, and that suggests that Pulakesin was unable to storm and occupy Kanchi, and there is no reason that he would not have tried to do so after having advanced so far. And the years that passed immediately after this were marked mainly by smaller conflicts that had happened between the Gangas and the feudatories, and there was nothing much that was written in stone. And some years later came Pulakesin's desire for the final push, another attack on the Pallavas. He may have found the inconclusiveness of the Battle of Polilur against Mahendravarman I unsatisfying, and in any case, his desire for dominion across the south was being actively thwarted by the Pallavas. So he began a new campaign. There had been a change of guard in the Pallava house, and Narasimhavarman I, Mahamalla, was the new king. Narasimhavarman had taken over from his father Mahendravarman in 630 AD, and so this helps us guess where we are in history. What caused Pulakesin to believe that a new king and the death of his old rival was the time to attack is not known. But he gathered his armies and those of his feudatories and marched across the Deccan into Pallava territory. First, he took out the Banas. The Banas, if you remember, had helped him get the throne from Mangalesha, and then had switched sides and went over to the Pallavas. And then started a series of battles between Pulakesin and Narasimhavarman, the most spoken about among them being the ones in Pariyala, Suramara, and the main one in Manimangalam, a town that exists even today, about 20 kilometers east of Kanchipuram. Pulakesin faced defeats in all these battles. Maybe he had not accounted for the Pallavas having regrouped after what they had considered to be a humiliation suffered by Mahendravarman, and them being a new fighting force against which the mighty Chalukyan army had no answer. In 642 AD, the two armies clashed at Manimangalam, and Pulakesin suffered a terrible loss of men, of materials, and he decided to withdraw. Ordering his armies to retreat, he made his way back to Vatapi. But Narasimhavarman wasn't going to leave it there. He wanted a conclusion. So he decided to give chase to the Chalukyan army, and he marched after them, probably without even returning to his capital Kanchi first. At a good pace, an army of the day could not have advanced further than 2 kilometers an hour. The 650 kilometers between Manimangalam and Badami must have taken the better part of 3 weeks. Led by Narasimhavarman and his fearsome general Paranjoti, the armies clashed at Vatapi, right in the heart of the Chalukya capital, and Pulakesin met his end. And how we know this is because all references to him on inscriptions abruptly stopped after the Battle of Vatapi. And just like that, Satyashraya, the refuge of truth, Prithvi Vallabha, the Lord of the earth, Parameshwara, the Supreme Lord, Maharaja, Maharajadi Raja, and Dakshinapata Prithvi Swami, the Lord of the entire Deccan, simply ceased to exist. What was the measure of this man, called the greatest ruler of the Chalukyas? I quote this excerpt from a wonderful passage that I read in historian K.V. Ramesh's book, The Chalukyas of Vatapi. Here goes. If an objective researcher is asked to portray on the wide canvas of history the personality of Immadi Pulakesi in all its dimensions, what features characteristic of that human colossus should he transfuse from his knowledge into that portrait? We cannot but conclude that in his own way, Pulakesin II was a bundle of contradictions, those very contradictions contributing to his greatness as an emperor. But should his face betray the sense of forlorn despair on losing his imperial legacy, or should it reflect the grit and determination with which he gained the throne? Should his eyes shine with ambition, or should they be blurred by the despair and anguish of his final defeat when the entire empire that he had fought to build tumbled down before his weary eyes? Should Satyashraya, Immadi Pulakesin the Great, have his hand depicted as carrying the sword stained with the blood of his own uncle and innumerable other victims? Or should it be shown pouring the waters of libation for the many munificent grants that he had made? What a wonderful quote that is. Truly, to describe the multifaceted personality of Pulakesin II in its entirety is a challenging task even for the best of historians. After the Battle of Vatapi, we know that the Pallavas occupied the capital, But what did Narasimhavarman do with the Chalukyan dynasty? And how did this affect the dreaded General Paranjoti? And the mystery of the Vatapi Ganapati? All this in the next episode, coming soon. Keep an eye on us. I am Ramjee Chandran, and this is the History of Bangalore.